I watched the reports come back heavier each week, while the results stayed thin. My orders said the weapon was sound, but the boats kept returning with the same quiet failures. I let captains change what the system insisted was correct, knowing the risk would be theirs and mine. Each success carried the weight of those who never lived to see the correction. In the opening months of 1942, the Pacific Ocean became the primary operating theater for the United States Navy's submarine force. Following the attack on Pearl Harbor on 7 December 1941, American submarines were among the few assets immediately available to strike at Japanese sea communications. Their assigned mission was clear in outline, if difficult in execution: disrupt the movement of fuel, raw materials, and troops across a maritime empire that stretched from the home islands to Southeast Asia. At the time, Japanese shipping moved under assumptions formed during decades of naval planning. The Imperial Japanese Navy had prepared extensively for a decisive fleet engagement, not a prolonged campaign against commerce raiders. Escort forces were limited, convoy doctrine was underdeveloped, and anti-submarine warfare remained a secondary concern. Japanese planners believed their sea lanes would remain largely secure so long as surface superiority was maintained. American submarines began war patrols under less confident conditions. Many boats were already in the Pacific before December 1941, but they entered combat with untested equipment, peacetime training habits, and operational doctrines still shaped by pre-war theory. The fleet was scattered between Pearl Harbor, Fremantle, Brisbane, and the U.S. West Coast. Communications were uneven, repair facilities overstretched, and intelligence about Japanese shipping routes incomplete. One of the officers working within these constraints was Lieutenant Commander Charles Swede Mommsen, assigned to submarine squadron staff duties at Pearl Harbor during the first half of 1942. His role was not that of a frontline commander at sea, but of an observer and analyst. Each returning submarine submitted patrol reports detailing sightings, attacks, and weapon performance. Mommsen's daily routine involved reading these documents, comparing claimed attacks with results, and identifying patterns that might explain the growing disparity between effort and effect. The reports were troubling. Submarines frequently achieved favorable attack positions, fired torpedoes under controlled conditions, and heard explosions that suggested hits. Yet follow-up intelligence rarely confirmed sinkings. Ships reported as damaged or destroyed often appeared again in Japanese records weeks later. In some cases, crews reported torpedoes striking hulls without detonating. In others, torpedoes ran erratically or passed beneath targets at close range. These inconsistencies were not immediately recognized as systemic failures. Early explanations varied. Commanding officers blamed poor angle of approach, unexpected evasive maneuvers, or errors in range estimation. Some suspected that Japanese ships were sturdier than anticipated, or that their damage control practices were unusually effective. The idea that the Mark 14 torpedo itself might be fundamentally unreliable met resistance, particularly among ordnance specialists ashore. Operationally, the consequences were immediate. Submarine commanders acting under standing orders to conserve torpedoes often broke off attacks after limited salvos. A missed opportunity could not easily be corrected, as reloading took time and increased the risk of counter-detection. Japanese escorts, though not numerous, were alert enough to force submarines deep after an attack. In shallow waters around the Philippines, Java Sea, and South China Sea, escape margins were narrow. Japanese naval commanders observing shipping losses in early 1942 saw little cause for alarm. Sinkings were sporadic and widely dispersed. Losses could be attributed to surface raiders, mines, or isolated submarine successes rather than a coordinated campaign. Reports from merchant captains emphasized confusion more than fear. Convoying was discussed but not consistently implemented. Within the American submarine force, however, concern grew steadily. Patrol after patrol returned with accounts of near successes that produced no measurable effect on Japanese logistics. The frustration was not dramatic but cumulative. Officers who had trained for years to execute precise attacks found themselves unable to trust the results of their own work. At Pearl Harbor, Mommsen and other staff officers began informal comparisons between patrol areas. Boats operating in shallow coastal waters reported higher rates of apparent torpedo failure than those firing in deeper approaches. Crews firing with magnetic exploders disabled reported fewer premature detonations, though this contradicted official recommendations. These observations circulated quietly, often in handwritten notes or private conversations rather than formal memoranda. The commanding officers at sea adapted in small ways. Some adjusted depth settings manually, compensating for suspected errors. Others altered firing angles to favor direct contact hits rather than relying on magnetic influence. These changes were not sanctioned, neither were they openly discouraged, so long as patrol reports avoided explicit criticism of equipment. Japanese anti-submarine measures during this period remained limited in scope. Escort vessels were few, depth charge stocks modest, and detection equipment basic. The lack of immediate shipping losses reinforced existing beliefs that American submarines posed a manageable threat. Japanese commanders continued to prioritize fleet readiness over convoy protection, allocating destroyers to offensive tasks rather than escort duty. By late 1942, the contrast between expectation and outcome became more pronounced. American submarine patrols increased in number, but confirmed sinkings did not rise proportionally. The operational problem was no longer a matter of isolated mishaps, it was embedded in the daily experience of the force. Mommsen's review files grew thicker. Each patrol report added another data point, another example of effort without result. Yet there was no single moment of realization, no dramatic confrontation with authority. Instead, there was a steady accumulation of doubt, shared quietly among officers who compared notes and recalculated assumptions. The Japanese shipping system continued to function, moving oil from the Dutch Indies, coal from China, and troops between island garrisons. Losses occurred, but not at a level that forced immediate doctrinal change. From Tokyo, the war at sea still appeared to favor control through surface power and air patrols. For the American submarine force, the gap between assigned mission and achieved effect remained unresolved as 1942 drew towards its end. The tools at hand were imperfect, the guidance conflicted, and the enemy's vulnerability remained largely theoretical. The situation demanded adjustment, but the path towards it was not yet clear. By early 1943, the operational tempo of the American submarine force increased steadily. New boats arrived in the Pacific, older vessels returned from overhaul, and patrol areas expanded deeper into Japanese-controlled waters. With more hulls at sea, expectations rose correspondingly. The assumption within higher command was that increased presence would naturally translate into increased results. Instead, patrol summaries revealed a more troubling pattern. The number of attacks climbed, but verified sinkings did not keep pace. In several patrol zones, particularly the East China Sea, the approaches to Formosa, and the South China Sea, submarines reported repeated engagements against lightly escorted merchant traffic with minimal confirmed outcomes. Ships were hit but not sunk, damaged but not removed from service, or missed entirely despite favorable firing conditions. Japanese records from the same period reflected concern but not alarm. Losses were noted, yet shipping schedules continued with limited disruption. The Imperial Japanese Navy still lacked a unified convoy system. Merchant vessels often sailed independently or in small groups, escorted intermittently depending on local availability. Anti-submarine patrols were reactive rather than systematic. American submarine commanders began to voice their frustrations more directly within internal channels. Patrol reports increasingly included detailed technical observations, sometimes appended separately from official narratives. These notes described torpedoes running too deep, failing to detonate on solid contact, or exploding prematurely at distances inconsistent with magnetic influence theory. At Pearl Harbor and Fremantle, staff officers attempted to reconcile these accounts with official assurances from the Bureau of Ordnance. Test data from controlled environments continued to support the reliability of the Mark 14 torpedo. Field reports, however, suggested otherwise. The discrepancy produced tension between operational commands and technical authorities. Rear Admiral Charles A. Lockwood, commanding U.S. submarines in the Pacific, was among those growing skeptical. His position required balancing institutional loyalty with responsibility for results. While careful not to openly challenge Ordnance doctrine, Lockwood authorized limited local testing whenever possible. Submarines were instructed to collect physical evidence when feasible: damaged torpedoes, exploder fragments, or eyewitness observations following misfires. The results were inconclusive but consistent. Depth-keeping errors appeared persistent. Contact exploders failed at certain angles. Magnetic exploders behaved unpredictably near the equator, where variations in Earth's magnetic field differed from those used in pre-war calibration. None of these findings, taken alone, constituted definitive proof. Together, they suggested systemic fault. At sea, commanders adapted out of necessity. Many began disabling magnetic exploders entirely, relying solely on contact detonation despite official guidance. Some adjusted firing doctrines to favor closer-range shots, accepting higher personal risk to ensure better impact angles. These practices spread informally, passed from crew to crew without formal endorsement. Japanese escorts, though still limited, gradually improved their response. Depth charge attacks became more coordinated, and patrol aircraft increased in certain choke points. While still lacking sophisticated detection equipment, Japanese forces learned from experience, refining search patterns and response timing. The ocean, once permissive, became incrementally more dangerous. Despite these adaptations on both sides, Japanese shipping losses remained manageable through most of 1943. Fuel shortages were not yet critical, and troop movements continued largely as planned. From Tokyo's perspective, American submarines were an irritation rather than a decisive threat. Within the American command structure, however, patience wore thin. The strategic importance of submarine warfare was understood, but its execution lagged behind necessity. Each failed attack represented not only a missed opportunity, but an erosion of confidence among crews tasked with operating alone for weeks at a time. The tension between official doctrine and operational reality sharpened. Reports from the field contradicted established technical positions, yet formal acknowledgement remained slow. The problem was no longer merely mechanical, it had become institutional. By mid-1943, the American submarine force stood at a crossroads. Its officers had identified patterns of failure, improvised partial solutions, and documented their experiences with increasing clarity. What remained unresolved was whether these observations would translate into sanctioned change or continue to exist only as unofficial adjustments made under pressure. By late summer of 1943, the accumulation of operational evidence reached a point where quiet adaptation was no longer sufficient. The American submarine force had learned how to work around some of its limitations, but those workarounds depended on individual judgment rather than institutional approval. This placed responsibility squarely on commanding officers, who bore the consequences of decisions made without formal backing. Rear Admiral Charles Lockwood, now firmly established as Commander, Submarines Pacific Fleet, faced a dilemma common to wartime organizations under strain. The official position of the Bureau of Ordnance continued to assert that the Mark 14 torpedo and its exploder mechanisms were fundamentally sound. To contradict that position openly would risk internal conflict, delay, and potential disciplinary consequences. Yet continued adherence to official doctrine was producing unsatisfactory results. Lockwood chose a narrow path between defiance and compliance. Rather than issuing fleet-wide directives that challenged ordnance authority, he encouraged controlled experimentation within operational limits. Submarine commanders were granted discretion to adjust exploder settings and depth controls based on observed performance, provided such actions were framed as tactical judgment rather than technical critique. One of the clearest informal shifts involved the magnetic exploder. Originally intended to detonate beneath a ship's keel, breaking its structural integrity, the device had proven unreliable in combat conditions. Variations in magnetic fields, ship construction, and approach angles produced inconsistent results. By 1943, many submarine commanders disabled the magnetic feature entirely before patrol, despite its continued endorsement in official manuals. This decision was not made lightly. Disabling the magnetic exploder reduced the theoretical lethality of each torpedo. It also removed a safety margin that ordnance designers had considered essential. Yet continued patrol after patrol demonstrated that contact detonations, while imperfect, offered greater predictability than magnetic influence firing. Depth-keeping adjustments followed a similar pattern. Crews recalibrated torpedo settings based on real-world behavior rather than test tank specifications. These adjustments were often crude, relying on trial, error, and collective memory passed between crews during brief port stays. No standardized correction existed, but the shared understanding that torpedoes ran deeper than set became widespread. The risks associated with these unofficial decisions were personal as well as professional. Submarine warfare allowed little margin for error. Closing range to improve firing angles exposed boats to detection, counterattack, and damage from depth charges. A misjudged approach could trap a submarine in shallow water with limited escape options. Japanese anti-submarine forces, though still uneven in quality, had begun to respond more aggressively in key shipping lanes. Convoy escorts became more common around oil routes from the Dutch East Indies. Patrol aircraft increased over straits and harbor approaches. While detection technology lagged behind Allied standards, experience compensated in part. Japanese escorts learned to react faster, deploy depth charges more methodically, and coordinate surface and air assets. In this environment, American submarine commanders weighed each engagement carefully. The decision to attack at close range, using modified torpedo settings, placed greater stress on crews already operating under extended patrol schedules. Fatigue accumulated, equipment wear increased, yet confirmed sinkings slowly began to rise. These successes were modest at first and unevenly distributed. Some patrols returned with verified results that aligned with reported attacks, others still experienced failures. The difference was not dramatic, but it was measurable. Intelligence summaries showed a gradual increase in Japanese merchant losses that could not be explained by surface action or mines alone. Japanese naval authorities began to take note. Reports from regional commands described rising shipping attrition in specific corridors. Damage assessments indicated that ships struck by torpedoes were more likely to sink outright rather than limp back to port. Insurance rates for merchant vessels rose. Requests for additional escorts increased, though destroyer availability remained limited. Within the American submarine force, the shift produced a change in confidence rather than triumph. Crews did not celebrate breakthroughs, they acknowledged incremental improvement. Commanding officers remained cautious, aware that their methods still lacked formal endorsement and that success depended on continued improvisation. At Pearl Harbor, staff officers like Mommsen reviewed the new data with guarded interest. The correlation between adjusted tactics and improved outcomes strengthened the case that earlier failures had not been due solely to operator error. However, converting operational evidence into institutional change required navigating entrenched bureaucratic structures. The turning point, such as it was, did not occur in a conference room or formal test range. It emerged from the cumulative weight of patrol results that increasingly contradicted official assumptions. Lockwood compiled comparative analyses, pairing attack narratives with post-war shipping intelligence and damage reports. The pattern was no longer dismissible as coincidence. Still, official acknowledgement lagged. The Bureau of Ordnance requested further testing under controlled conditions, citing variables that could skew combat reports.
Lockwood complied where possible, but the pace of war limited opportunities for exhaustive trials. Submarines could not be spared easily, and test facilities remained scarce in forward areas. In the meantime, the unofficial practices continued. Magnetic exploders remained disabled on many boats. Depth corrections were applied as standard practice rather than exception. Crews trained replacements based on experience rather than manuals. The submarine force, in effect, evolved its doctrine from the bottom up. For Japanese commanders, the change manifested as a gradual but undeniable increase in shipping losses. Oil tankers failed to arrive on schedule. Replacement hauls could not match attrition. While the full implications were not yet apparent, the margin for error in Japan's maritime logistics began to narrow. The adjustment that had begun as individual judgment now carried strategic weight. It was not the result of a single decision or dramatic confrontation, but of accumulated experience translated into quiet action. The risk borne by submarine commanders had become personal, but its effects extended beyond individual patrols. As 1943 drew to a close, the American submarine force operated under a hybrid system: official doctrine on paper, practical doctrine at sea. The tension between the two remained unresolved, but the balance was shifting. The question was no longer whether adaptation was necessary, but whether it would be formally recognized before the costs of delay grew higher.
By early 1944, the consequences of the submarine force's unofficial adaptations became increasingly visible, both at sea and within command structures. The rising number of confirmed sinkings could no longer be dismissed as coincidence or isolated success. Shipping intelligence compiled from intercepted communications, aerial reconnaissance, and post-war reconstruction estimates showed a clear trend: Japanese merchant losses were accelerating, particularly along fuel and raw material routes. This shift placed pressure on institutions slow to change. The Bureau of Ordnance, faced with mounting operational data contradicting its earlier conclusions, began to reassess its position. Formal tests conducted in Hawaiian waters confirmed what submarine crews had long reported. Torpedoes consistently ran deeper than their set depths. Contact exploders failed at certain impact angles. Magnetic exploders behaved unpredictably across different latitudes. These findings did not immediately translate into full accountability. Reports were framed carefully, emphasizing calibration errors rather than design flaws. Language mattered. Institutional credibility remained a priority, even as operational necessity drove rapid adjustments in the field. Rear Admiral Lockwood pushed cautiously but persistently. He authorized fleet-wide changes that formalized many practices already in use. Magnetic exploders were officially disabled, and depth settings were corrected based on empirical testing. These directives, issued without fanfare, marked a quiet but decisive shift from theory-driven doctrine to experience-based policy. The effects were swift. Submarine commanders no longer needed to justify unofficial modifications or conceal deviations from manuals. Training pipelines incorporated revised procedures. Torpedo performance, while still imperfect, became predictable enough to support coordinated attack planning. Japanese anti-submarine efforts intensified in response. Convoy systems expanded, escorts were reassigned from offensive duties, and air patrols increased over critical sea lanes. Yet these measures faced structural limits. Japan lacked sufficient escort vessels, radar technology, and fuel reserves to protect all routes simultaneously. Each improvement came at the cost of another vulnerability. The human cost of the earlier period of failure remained present within the American submarine community. Boats lost in 1942 and 1943 could not be recovered, and crews who had gone down with them never benefited from later corrections. This awareness shaped attitudes in 1944. Success was measured soberly, not triumphantly. Within Japanese Naval Command, assessments grew more urgent. Reports acknowledged that American submarines were operating with increasing effectiveness and tactical consistency. Shipping losses began to affect industrial output and military mobility. Oil shortages, once theoretical, became operational constraints. The stakes peaked not in a single engagement, but across a widening operational front. Each successful patrol compounded the logistical strain on Japan's war economy. Each convoy rerouted or delayed reduced flexibility elsewhere. The submarine campaign had become a persistent pressure rather than a series of isolated incidents. Yet resistance to full doctrinal reevaluation persisted on both sides. Japanese planners continued to prioritize decisive battle concepts even as attrition mounted. American ordnance authorities remained cautious in assigning responsibility for earlier failures, framing the episode as a learning process rather than a corrective reckoning. By mid-1944, the operational balance had shifted decisively, though without dramatic declaration. Submarines operated with clearer guidance, better expectations, and growing confidence in their weapons. The cost of earlier institutional hesitation was evident, but the system had adapted enough to capitalize on the remaining window of opportunity. The campaign was no longer defined by uncertainty over equipment alone. It had become a test of how quickly institutions could absorb lessons paid for in time, effort, and lives. By the latter half of 1944, the American submarine campaign in the Pacific had reached a level of effectiveness that required no public declaration. Its results were visible in Japanese port records, fuel allocation tables, and shipping schedules that no longer matched operational demands. The campaign's impact was cumulative rather than sudden, shaped by thousands of routine patrol decisions rather than any single engagement. Japanese maritime logistics, once assumed resilient, now operated under continuous strain. Oil tankers from the Dutch East Indies arrived less frequently and in smaller numbers. Coal shipments from China were delayed or rerouted. Replacement hulls could not keep pace with losses, and shipyards struggled with material shortages caused in part by the very disruptions they were meant to repair. Japanese commanders did not misunderstand what was happening, but they struggled to respond proportionally. Escort numbers remained insufficient, and the expansion of convoy systems came too late to fully reverse losses. Anti-submarine training improved, but without adequate radar, sonar, and air cover, defensive measures remained uneven. In internal assessments, American submarines were no longer described as an inconvenience. They were identified as a persistent threat to national endurance. On the American side, institutional adjustments gradually replaced improvisation. The Bureau of Ordnance issued revised technical guidance acknowledging depth control errors and exploder limitations. While the language avoided assigning blame, the substance reflected lessons drawn directly from submarine patrol experience. Testing protocols were updated, calibration standards revised, and feedback from operational units formally incorporated into design review. Within the submarine force, these changes were absorbed with quiet acceptance. There were no celebrations of vindication. Officers who had adapted early understood that success had come at a cost that could not be recovered. Boats lost before corrections were made remained a permanent part of the force's internal memory. Rear Admiral Lockwood continued to emphasize restraint in official communications. His reports focused on results rather than controversy, framing the campaign's success as the product of sustained effort and gradual refinement. This approach avoided public disputes while ensuring that operational realities guided future planning. Staff officers such as Mumson returned to more routine analytical work, now supported by clearer data. Patrol reports showed increasing alignment between claimed attacks and confirmed sinkings. Discrepancies still occurred, but they no longer defined the campaign. The tools, while imperfect, were finally predictable. By early 1945, Japanese shipping losses reached levels that directly constrained military operations. Aircraft production slowed due to fuel shortages. Troop movements became riskier and less frequent. Garrisons across the Pacific found themselves isolated not by sudden defeat, but by sustained deprivation.
Japanese post-war assessments would later note that the submarine threat had been underestimated in both scale and adaptability. The assumption that doctrine and planning could compensate for limited escort resources proved incorrect. The campaign revealed how quickly an opponent could learn under pressure and how costly delayed adaptation could be. For the American submarine force, the legacy was not of dramatic innovation, but of institutional learning driven by operational necessity. The campaign demonstrated the limits of pre-war assumptions and the importance of feedback from those closest to execution. The individuals involved did not seek recognition. Submarine commanders returned from patrol, submitted reports, and prepared for the next assignment. Staff officers compiled data, issued guidance, and refined procedures. The campaign advanced through repetition rather than spectacle. After the war, official histories would acknowledge the submarine force's role in undermining Japan's ability to sustain its war effort. Less emphasis would be placed on the early failures that delayed effectiveness. Those failures, however, shaped the character of the force and informed post-war doctrine across the Navy. The story of how American submarines learned, quickly, unevenly, and at cost, remains a reminder that military effectiveness is rarely the product of flawless planning. More often, it emerges from correction, persistence, and the willingness to adjust when reality refuses to conform to expectation. If this story added clarity to a lesser-known part of the Pacific War, consider subscribing to support continued coverage of overlooked individuals and quiet campaigns that shaped history.